For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and you're watching our weekly flagship show, The Talking Point. A warm welcome to all our viewers, no matter where you are across the globe and what time it is. And a warm welcome to Jeff Smith, who joins us from Washington, D.C. He's a research fellow with the Heritage Foundation and an author. He's been on our shows many times. Thanks, Jeff, for waking up early this morning.
Thanks for having me on.
And also from Bengaluru, we're joined by Ambassador P.S. Raghavan. He's been India's former chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, as well as India's envoy to Russia. Ambassador Raghavan, good to see you, sir.
Hello, good evening. Good to be with you again.
Ambassador, just getting straight to the point, we were talking offline, chatting a bit. Why do you feel the CAATSA sanctions, if they are utilized by the US against India for the S-400, actually for them to operationalize it, because we bought it a long time back, or at least signed the deal, why do you think it's past its use-by date?
Well, you have to actually go back to the origins of CAATSA. CAATSA was passed by the US Congress in 2017, and it arose out of a domestic US situation where, there was this, the feeling that the Russians had interfered in the US elections and somehow helped President Trump to get elected. And the idea was that the Congress felt that President Trump was too soft on Russia, they wanted to impose sanctions on Russia, and they also wanted to ensure that they had the right, they had the control over its waiver, and that the president did not have. And out of all this also arose then this new, the legislation went through Congress, then a commercial angle came in, and they thought that they could also, extract commercial advantage by stopping Russian exports of defense and, in fact, energy as well to countries. So if you look at it, these are the considerations under which CAATSA came. So actually what happened was, from punishing Russia, it eventually turned to punishing countries for doing business with Russia, effectively. I mean, that's the way it affected India. Today, that purpose is gone. We are in a completely different situation. And in any case, the experience of CAATSA as well. Where has CAATSA been applied so far? It was applied against China, which of course makes no difference at all. China is not going to buy anything from the US, nor is the US going to buy anything from China. Therefore, the imposition of CAATSA on China may have been a good demonstrative act, but really was of no consequence. The only other country against which CAATSA has been applied is Turkey. And that, of course, also now is in limbo, as it's a NATO partner, and therefore you can't really impose CAATSA on it without hurting your relations with Turkey. And that brings me to this essential point. You can apply CAATSA on enemies, you cannot apply it to your friends, because when you apply it to your friends, you're actually harming the relations with friends. The whole purpose of CAATSA, has been explained by the US State Department in Congress once, is to wean countries away from Russia and to make them buy more from the United States. Now, in the case of India, you're now pushing an open door. India started diversifying from purchases from Russia 10 years ago, well before CAATSA. We are moving towards the West. We are moving towards acquisitions from the US as well. Our arms imports from the US have reached something like $20 billion from next to nothing in 2008. So look at all these put together. CAATSA is not the way to make us buy less from Russia and to buy more from the US or the other Western countries. It's something that we're doing anyway. And by saying that I'll force you to do it, you're actually worsening relations and not improving relations. And you really have such a fantastic strategic partnership with the US today. You do not require persuasive or coercive actions to move that forward. So I think that's really the case. I would say CAATSA is today an anachronism. It's not required. It doesn't help you with your enemies, and certainly doesn't help you with your friends. And Donald Trump is gone in any case. So of course, you cannot repeal CAATSA, because that means a more difficult process through Congress. and therefore you have to find a way of circumventing it. And I think Mr. Smith has written about it, about the various options of waiving or delaying or termination. Well, waiving is the simplest option which is there on the table, and which I think the US administration will use because they have all the conditions for using them. Mr. Smith has written about this as well.
Sure. I mean, we'll flesh out some of the ideas and thoughts that you raised there, Ambassador. But Jeff, exactly, as the Ambassador is pointing out, again, when we were offline, you put out these words, strategic malpractice. You want to elaborate on that?
Well, I agree violently with my my co-guest here. I would second really everything he said. And not only does it not help advance America's interests, it's directly counterproductive. And not only does it not hurt Russia, it actually helps Russia in many ways. I think it reinforces perceptions of the U.S. as unreliable, which is certainly problematic from our perspective. But it also makes Russia's sort of no sanctions, hands-off approach look even more attractive. If you're a country that is concerned with strategic autonomy, if you're a country that sort of takes offense to this notion that a third party should be telling us who we can and can't buy arms from. So I found CAATSA problematic from the very beginning. I think it's important to note, as has already been said, the road was paved with good intentions. I mean, CAATSA wasn't designed to be strategic malpractice. It wasn't designed to be counterproductive. It wasn't designed to hurt India-U.S. relations. It was born out of frustration in the U.S. Congress that there's a country interfering with our elections, and we've already sanctioned them to death unilaterally. What other options are available to us to apply pressure to them? And so, the idea of secondary sanctions comes. Well, if we can't harm them directly, maybe we can cut off their trade with others. In principle, in theory, that may have been an effective strategy implemented in a different way. But the way they went about it, for the reasons I've outlined and have already been outlined, I would argue has been strategic malpractice. And to be fair, most people in Washington recognize that, which is why they expanded the waiver authority, which is why you have U.S. congressmen and senators now speaking out and saying CAATSA sanctions on India would be a horrible idea.
Sure. That horrible idea, even if the indications, Ambassador, are that the easiest route, which is, as you pointed out, the waiver, comes through. How do the Russians see it? I mean, the Russians would like anything to hamper India-US ties, right?
Well, it's really not relevant how the Russians see it, because we are looking at this as our, as Mr. Smith said, we are looking at it at our right to buy from whom we want in equipment that suits our defense requirements. Now, obviously, the defense cooperation with Russia grew because Russia was providing us equipment which we required. Now, even if you look at S-400, I remember an earlier conversation I had with General Petraeus a few months ago. The fact of the matter is that the West, US and other countries of the West, are not in a position today to supply equipment which is equivalent to the S-400 for the purposes that we want to use it and for the terrain that we want to use it. And therefore, what are we talking about? I mean, it's not as if we want to buy from Russia because we like Russia. We want to buy from Russia because that equipment is what we want. And Russia is in a position to deliver it to us, and it is willing to deliver it to us. Because, there are also technology issues. We have not yet reached the stage of being able to acquire sensitive technologies of the kind that we want from the US, because there are some more formalities to be crossed. And more importantly, private companies in the US are also reluctant to share certain kinds of technology. So you have to get through all this. So it's not a question. We shouldn't be looking at it as how Russia will feel. I mean, Russia obviously wants us to buy as much as we can from them. But we have taken this decision to diversify, and we have taken this decision also to balance our defense, shall we say, portfolio.
Sure.
And then I think that's the way we need to look at it. We need to preserve our strategic autonomy, as Mr. Smith said, to buy from whom we want, what we want, as per what we want or require.
Absolutely. Jeff, again, when you talk about strategic malpractice, I mean, if the main game is to contain, constrain, counter China, and all these groupings have come up since the last year or so, Quad, and we've spoken about that so often, AUKUS, etc. Isn't it counterproductive if there are sanctions against India?
Absolutely. 100% counterproductive. And again, I think that's why we've seen a resistance movement come up on Capitol Hill toward this idea of sanctioning India. There are a few congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill who are personally invested in CAATSA, who either had a hand in writing the legislation or who are very personally invested in holding Russia accountable. And so we have a situation where there's a perception that if you go back on CAATSA, then you're going back on being tough on Russia, or you're admitting that the legislation was problematic in the first place. And so there's some resistance to that because of Russia, but there's really no one making the case that India should be sanctioned, that this advances our strategic. The case isn't there, period. And so you're in this sort of awkward dance where I think folks recognize how problematic CAATSA is, but it's not so easy just to wish it away. And I fear we're going to get in a situation where everyone recognizes that, CAATSA sanctions in the India context are counterproductive. And so we just have to keep issuing waivers. Because as we both know, the S-400 is not going to be the last Indian purchase of Russian defense equipment. There have actually already been other additional purchases since the S-400, and I'm sure there will be more to come, as everyone who watches, Indian defense procurement already knows. And I would prefer that we find a long-term legislative remedy rather than, every other year having to issue a new waiver and then extend the waiver. And I feel when it becomes enough of a hassle and enough Hill staffers find this problematic that maybe eventually we'll get a movement to fundamentally rewrite the legislation. But for now, I think we're going to have to deal with these short-term waivers.
Short-term vis-a-vis strategic autonomy and long-term, Ambassador, again, as you pointed out, India has been able to rely on Russia whenever it needed to in the past, even when China and Galwan was happening.
No, that is true. That cuts both ways. We actually, because of our history of import of equipment from Russia, about 60 to 70% of our inventory in the armed forces is still Russian or Soviet in fact. And we have to find a way of also gradually dealing with increasing our own capacity. That is an important aspect as well. And therefore, when we look at new equipment from Russia, Mr. Smith said that we are increasing that more new equipment has been ordered and is being ordered from Russia. By the way, there is one element in CAATSA which talks about significant defense transactions. So many of these systems that we are now importing should actually not come under that head. If you're talking about helicopters, if you're talking about frigates, if you're talking about these submarine refits, all of these do not actually attack CAATSA at all. But the problem arises because in the interpretation, it basically you leave it to some officials in the US to determine what attracts CAATSA and what doesn't attract CAATSA, and that has the potential of being an irritant as we go along, because we don't want to be in a situation where for every purchase you go back to the US and say, is this all right? Does this attract CAATSA? Will you give me a waiver for this? That is not good for the quality of the relationship. So we need to have some kind of a solution by which one of the waiver conditions is that the US administration should be convinced that we are taking adequate measures to wean ourselves away from Russia. I mean, the country should take. That's something, as I said before, we do not need to convince you of. This is something that has been going on for the last 10 years. And if that can be used to get some kind of a general waiver rather than a specific waiver, we need to look at this particular subject. And we should not be looking at every system and seeking a waiver for every system. It's something that I think our diplomacy has to work on, right? Both Indian and American diplomacy.
Diplomacy, but Jeff, as you were pointing out, a long-term solution for this would require legislation. Are there any other options?
Well, actually, there has been legislation introduced or at least spoken about in the past week or two, which would be a creative solution, which would essentially make any member of the Quad exempt from CAATSA sanctions. And, India would be the sort of obvious target of that. In some ways, it makes a lot of sense. If you're part of this, enduring coalition, this set of strategic partners with the U.S., then you get a set of preferential treatment when it comes to legislation like this. It's a little early to say how far that proposed legislation will go, but it is at least one potential creative workaround that would probably be an easier lift than sort of rewriting CAATSA altogether.
But I've seen a little bit of analysis in terms of what the ambassador and you were also talking about, of weaning away India from Russian arms sales. Is there any specifics that are showing that? Because, I mean, when it came to unilateral sanctions against Iran, India complied with oil, at least, not buying Iranian oil. Of course, it's a different situation.
Yeah, it was a different situation, and it was easy for India to substitute Iranian oil purchases with purchases from another country. That option simply isn't available in the Russia case. And India obviously has a much more important relationship with Russia that it fears alienating Moscow at a time when it's still reliant on Moscow to maintain, a significant portion of its defense equipment. And so I think U.S. policymakers do recognize and must recognize that they're not directly comparable situations. And that India has, frankly, a resistance to enforcing unilaterally imposed sanctions from other countries. I would say the Iranian example was more of the exception rather than the rule, a welcome exception where it was great to see India cooperating on this front, but not a precedent which suggests India should have simply gone along with Russia sanctions too, since it went along with Iran sanctions. I think people who have been watching India for a long time knew that the two situations were not comparable.
Sure. Master, as you pointed out earlier, I mean, it can't be, every time there is some kind of deal with the Russians or anyone else that could possibly, upset the Americans, that you have to go back to the Americans, or even if you don't have to go back to them specifically. There's been a lot of talk from the Russians itself that for the S-500, which may be just an incremental step from S-400, the Indians are on the top of the list.
Sorry, that the Indians are?
On top of the list for the S-500. I mean, like you were pointing out earlier, like you can't, for every purchase, keep going back. So what is the solution then?
No, as I said, of course, there is one provision in CAATSA that it's only a significant defense transaction. And they've specifically said that upgrading or servicing existing equipment will not actually attract CAATSA. So presumably, I mean, I don't know actually the details and how significantly different or how significantly improved from a technology perspective the S-500 is, or whether it will attract it. As I said, we should not be in a position to seek equipment by equipment waiver, because that makes life very difficult. In fact, one of the possibilities, if you go back to the 1980s, at a time when Pakistan was important to the US, in order to keep US-Pakistan defense cooperation going, the president had to give a certification every year to Congress that Pakistan was not acquiring a nuclear weapon. And the president did so. And that actually, so that was not an equipment by equipment dispensation. Every year he gave that certification, in spite of the fact, of course, that the Americans knew perfectly well that the Pakistanis were developing nuclear capability. But okay, they required Pakistan for various strategic reasons. That's all right. There is an explanation for it. We're not in the matter of justification or moralization. But what I mean is that is a possibility of something like that, some kind of a carve out like that, if you like, which can put India on a white list, on a CAATSA white list. It's like the Quad. What you were talking about, the Quad. It's a sort of a white list. You could look at India as a white list, but that is the way to avoid going back repeatedly for individual pieces of equipment. And let's not forget also that you don't want to give bureaucrats a field day. You have the political leadership, you have a government, but you also have bureaucrats who want to read rules more carefully and so on. And this is not, of course, unique to US or India or any country. Bureaucrats are bureaucrats everywhere in the world. So, you need something which is more lasting and less iffy.
Again, Jeff, the logical question that people come up with is, if America wants to sanction India, in this case, I mean, not sanction India, but whatever the historical reasons for it, for S-400s, and what is the option that the Americans are giving India? Is there a comparable system? And before you answer, I just want to take a few questions because there are lots of them. Manik Thiru says, instead of imposing sanctions, is the US ready to co-develop, co-produce surface to air missile shield equivalent or better than the S-500 with India to prevent India buying the S-500? There's another question from Ndilo. What are the prospects of Indo-US cooperation on long-range surface radar? There's a history he goes into about the Israeli Green Pine radar ones, etc. But you get the general drift, Jeff.
Yeah, and the truth is, I've talked to military folks in the U.S., knowledgeable people in the defense establishment, and they will admit that the U.S. does not have a system comparable to the S-400, not directly comparable. We have a series of other systems that taken together can provide air defense cover similar to S-400, but no, not directly comparable, and not any one system. And so I think it's important for U.S. policymakers to recognize that. I mean, that's the reality. And in terms of co-development, we have had some cooperation on missile defense before. I see no reason that we can't have cooperation on air defense and missile defense in the future. But progress has been slow. I mean, if you look at the DTTI, Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, that was set up under the Obama administration to try to kickstart co-development of defense projects, and it's moved at a somewhat glacial pace. I mean, we set up a prototype in the public sector and private sector, worked on them together for years. None of them were eventually taken forward to the co-production stage. It was rejiggered in the Trump administration. No real progress was made. President Biden came in, and we've now made a new attempt at reviving the DTTI, and we're going to try to produce, I believe, unmanned aerial vehicles together, sort of starting with a more simple, basic project to see if we can build the habits of cooperation. But it's been slow. It's been slow. So to talk about, co-production or co-development of relatively advanced air defense system, I think is many years down the road. But that doesn't mean the U.S. doesn't have anything in terms of radar or air defense that would be helpful to India's defense needs. I absolutely think it does, and there is room to cooperate there, but not anything directly comparable to the S-400. It's just the reality.
Sorry, I was mute there. I said, Ambassador Raghavan, we've seen what the Trump former NSA Bolton had to write recently, but that also, I mean, in your experience, have the Americans offered us such high technology? Can there? Is there anything comparable?
No,
Should they?
I think, as was said, they actually admit that they do not have a system comparable to the S-400, operating under conditions that the S-400 operate. We need to understand also the conditions under which we needed to operate, the terrain in which we need to operate. And I think I was telling you offline, I had a very long discussion with General Petraeus a few months ago, when he was also telling us to go get off the S-400, but admitting that there was no comparable system on offer. And I agree entirely. You can join up with the Americans to co-develop systems, but that is only something that's going to deliver 5 or 10 years down the line, and you need this system tomorrow. So there are these images. And by the way, DTTI, I must say that you mentioned the DTTI in the Obama administration. There was a precursor to the DTTI. I forget what it was called, but I was involved in discussions with America at that time during the Vajpayee government and the Bush administration. And in fact, the previous American ambassador here, Ken Juster, was in the Commerce Department heading that. That also did not deliver anything. The problem really is that technology is in the hands of the private sector, the military industrial complex in the US. And therefore, unlike in Russia, where everything is owned by the government, and that also adds another layer of complication to this. Anyway, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work through it. We have to work through it, but it takes longer. And it takes longer for new systems to be set, particularly when sensitive technologies are involved.
Jeff, there's been a lot of recent reporting about the what is it, the MQ-8, MQ-9, Sea Guardian, the Reapers. A deal may be signed. Now, of course, these deals don't happen overnight. They would have been happening for years, if not at least a decade. But if it does come during a time when the US administration gives a waiver for the S-400s, will it be seen as lubricating that, to use a crude word?
What do you mean by duplicating that?
Lubricating it, in the sense that it's a sweetener. Yeah, it's a sweetener.
Okay. Yeah, well, technically that shouldn't have any impact on things, but in reality, politics is local, and it probably does lubricate things a little bit. But the problem isn't that CAATSA is not designed to force India to buy American. I know it's been mentioned that there's a commercial angle to it. I'm sure every U.S. congressman and every U.S. defense company would prefer that India buy more from the U.S. rather than Russia. But it is not the policy of the United States government to punish India for not buying Americans. And I would hesitate to overstate the sort of commercial aspect of that in the CAATSA calculation. And so I think India making additional defense purchases from the U.S. is good for the relationship. I think it's good for India. I think some of the platforms India has purchased from the U.S. in recent years have substantially enhanced its capabilities, including along the line of actual control, but also in the maritime arena, also with the P-8I surveillance aircraft, with the C-17s, the transport capabilities, and frankly, these drones are very capable platforms. I think that's all good, and I think that only helps India's case in Washington. But I don't think the two are. It's not sort of apples and apples on the playing field. It's not as if, well, now that India's made this purchase, then several U.S. congressmen and senators say CAATSA doesn't matter anymore. It's not a strong arm tactic to force Indian purchases of U.S. defense equipment. That's just not the reality. But Indian purchases of U.S. defense equipment do help its case more broadly, which can sort of filter down into the CAATSA debate, if that's fair.
Sure. But in terms of the formal waiver, if and when it happens, Jeff, I mean, does it require time? Because the justification all these months was that we've told the Indians about their concerns when Austin was here, and others have been meeting, but it depends on the delivery. Now, the Russians have already said that the delivery has begun. Putin comes early December. There'll be a summit, and it's expected for that. They're talking about operationalizing by the end of the year. So, how does that work in terms of a waiver and the operationalization of the system?
Well, in Turkey's case, it's quite interesting that over a year went by after delivery of the S-400 to Turkey, and the Trump administration had not issued any sanctions. And eventually, Capitol Hill had to begin pressuring the Trump administration and saying, look, we wrote this legislation. Under this, you need to sanction Turkey or provide us a reason why you're issuing a waiver or terminating the sanctions or delaying the sanctions. And only after that pressure from Capitol Hill, I think it was a year and a half after delivery, did the Trump administration finally levy sanctions. But I believe the way it's written, it's supposed to be within 1 or 2 months of delivery of the S-400 or the significant transaction, whatever it is. The administration is supposed to make a determination within a short time frame after delivery. So I would expect the Biden administration will probably stick more closely to the legislation, and within 2 months of delivery will make its case either for a waiver or will apply the sanctions.
Ambassador, if you want to wrap up your thoughts, I mean, we do know the summit with Putin is happening. Go ahead.
I'd like to clarify one of the statements I made about the commercial motivation for CAATSA. Actually, this was said by Assistant Secretary of the State Department, Ford, in a testimony to Congress, where he actually said that we would like them to buy more from us or our allies, and that is one of the objectives of CAATSA. In fact, that's something that he said, which got a lot of publicity at that time. This was a few years ago. The other point is about when the sanctions become applicable. Again, in the same testimony, Mr. Ford actually said that there is some ambiguity apparently in the legislation as to when you can apply it, either when you've made the payment for that significant transaction, or at the time of delivery, or at the time of operationalization. Now, my impression, by the way, is that the Turkish case, the sanctions were delayed because Turkey had got delivery, but had not operationalized the S-400, whatever that means. So there are a few gray areas there which the administration can play with and tell Congress that it is not at this time, but it is at that time that the sanctions kick in.
Yeah, 100% true. And I still have Hill staffers asking me, so when do we have to make a decision on CAATSA? And I said, you guys wrote the bill. You told me.
They don't ask you if we have to impose it. They say when.
If I'm lucky, they ask me if. Yeah.
No, but bureaucracy loves this kind of ambiguity, you see, because then it can use it to its advantage whenever it requires.
Yeah.
Point. Jeff Smith, absolute pleasure having you again on StratNews Global. Have a good day, even though we've woken you up early in the morning.
You guys take care. It was great to join you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Nice to meet you.
And Ambassador Raghavan. Yeah, Ambassador
Thanks.
Raghavan, as usual. Great seeing you. I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more of you with President Putin coming in December. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And a reminder to all our viewers, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as well for the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. This is Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.